They called our dimension broken. We called it Tuesday. Then we fixed theirs too. The bomb wasn't supposed to go off like that. Captain Dace Harrow knew this the same way you know a glass is going to shatter the instant it leaves your hand. That split second between the slip and the sound when the physics are already decided and your body just hasn't caught up to the news yet. He knew it in the hollow below his sternum, in the tendons of both hands locked around the stick of his fighter, in the sudden white silence that swallowed the radio loud chatter from his wingman, and the mission controllers back on the Meridian Station platform, 40,000 feet below the orbital corridor, where everything was about to go completely, catastrophically wrong. The engineers had called for abort. He'd heard Sergeant Fellion's voice crack across the comms. Pull back! Pull back! The arming sequence is corrupted. Do not engage the oscillator. And behind that voice, like water rising beneath a door, he'd heard the ascending whine of something that had no right to be this far along in its cycle. The space-time oscillation device. Project Anchor. 7 years of theoretical physics made physical. A weapon that was supposed to carve a clean, permanent hole through the enemy's orbital infrastructure and leave the rest of space-time politely alone. Dace had looked at the mission clock. 12 seconds to detonation. The abort window was 4 seconds. The engineers were already dead. Their shuttle had taken a Voth interceptor's broadside and was spinning, silent and dark, into the upper atmosphere. There was nobody left who could turn the thing off from the inside. He did what he always did when the math stopped working in his favor. He improvised. He rolled his Cassian IV fighter hard to port and punched through the device's outer hull at 400 meters per second, clipping the oscillator housing with the starboard wing, trying to induce a physical interruption in the arming sequence. He'd read the technical specs on Anchor twice, once when it was first briefed, once the night before the mission when he couldn't sleep. He knew the oscillator needed 3 uninterrupted seconds to achieve resonance lock. Break the lock, break the detonation. He broke the housing. He broke the wing. He did not break the lock. The bomb went off, not with fire, not with the pressure wave of a conventional warhead, not with the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear device. It went off the way a dream ends when you're in the middle of it, with a tearing sensation, a horrible sense of things rearranging themselves at a level below perception, below molecular, below whatever the smallest unit of reality turned out to be. Colors he didn't have names for. Sounds that were also shapes. The feeling of his own continuity stretching like warm glass, pulling thin and thinner until he woke up in a meadow. This was the part he would have the most trouble explaining, later, to anyone who asked. Not the explosion, not the dimensional shear, not even the fact that his fighter was embedded nose first in a hillside 20 meters away, venting smoke into a sky the color of a healing bruise. All of that had explanations, or would eventually. What he could not explain was the meadow itself. The specific quality of the grass, a rich blue-green that shouldn't have existed. The way the wind moved through it in slow, considered waves, as though the meadow was breathing. The smell of something sweet and complex, like rain and copper and distant bread. The sheer, stubborn ordinariness of a meadow in the middle of whatever impossible thing had just happened to him. He sat up. His flight suit was intact. His helmet had a crack along the left temple. His sidearm was still in its holster. He had a headache that felt like someone had replaced his brain with a smaller, angrier brain. He cataloged these facts the way his instructors at the Cascade Military Academy had drilled into him. Injury assessment first, then situation assessment, then threat assessment. You're no good to anyone if you bleed out before you figure out what you're bleeding for. His situation assessment was brief, because the situation was he had absolutely no idea where he was. The sky was wrong. Not badly wrong, not alien wrong, but subtly wrong, in the way that makes your eyes keep sliding back to check again. The clouds moved with slightly too much purpose. The horizon had a faint iridescent shimmer at 2 points, like heat shimmer but vertical, like the edge of something he couldn't quite see the front of. The gravity felt normal. The air tasted normal, maybe a shade thicker, slightly more mineral. He was still on Earth, or something close enough to Earth that his biology wasn't objecting. He was not in his own Earth. He was fairly certain of that. He was also not alone. The yawl came over the ridge 40 seconds after he finished his injury assessment, and they came in numbers. 6 ground vehicles, wide and low-slung, running on some kind of magnetic track system that left no ruts in the blue-green grass. Behind them, 2 aircraft, not fighters, more like heavy transports with armored flanks, the kind of thing you used when you expected resistance and wanted to absorb it rather than avoid it. The vehicles halted in a rough arc 40 meters out. Hatches opened. Dace counted 15 soldiers, maybe 20. Hard to be precise because they moved strangely, not badly, not uncoordinatedly. but with a quality he'd later learn to recognize as a fundamental difference in how their nervous systems managed group movement. The Y'all operated on something close to consensus cognition, when in units of 7 or more, a fact that was going to take him months to fully grasp and longer to stop finding unsettling. Right now, they just looked like soldiers who moved in a way that made the hairs on his arms stand up for reasons he couldn't name. They were humanoid, roughly his height, maybe slightly taller. Gray-blue skin, not the gray of illness or the blue of cold, but a deep natural shade like a winter sea, the kind of color that looked like it had been there since before color had opinions. Their faces were symmetrical in the way human faces were, 2 eyes and a mouth and a nose occupying roughly the positions evolution had settled on. But there was no genetic relatability in the bone structure, nothing that would have fooled a forensic anthropologist for a second. Their eyes had 2 irises each, an outer ring of amber and an inner ring of white, giving the impression of constant mild surprise, which Dace would come to realize was absolutely not how they felt most of the time. The one in front raised something that was clearly a weapon by any intelligent organism standards. Long, Matt, pointing at his face, and said something in a language that sounded like rushing water learning to speak. Dace raised his hands. He said, "I don't know what you're saying. I'm not a threat. My ship is down." He kept his voice flat and factual. Panic in the voice told an enemy things about your resource levels. He'd learned that the hard way in the Kessler engagement 3 years back. The lead Y'all's dual irises shifted, a lateral movement that was unmistakably their version of a squint. It said something to the one beside it, a shorter exchange, clipped and precise. Then it looked back at Dace and said, in heavily accented but recognizable standard Meridian English, "You are the nexus point." Dace lowered his hands slightly. This was not the thing he had expected them to say. The what? The nexus point. The Y'all said it again, the same intonation, as if repetition would clarify. The one who was in the oscillation event, the dimensional crossing anchor. You are the nexus point. "I'm Captain Dace Harrow," he said, "Cascadian Free Forces. Serial number CF4419 Delta. I don't know what a nexus point is." The Y'all looked at him with those double iris eyes for a long moment. Then it did something he didn't expect. It put the weapon down, not away, but down, pointed at the ground, in the specific posture of provisional non-hostility. "You will," it said. Their ship was a flying city, or near enough that the distinction felt academic. The Kethalomar, the Y'all called it that, which translated roughly to the house that moves and remembers, was 120 meters long, roughly wedge-shaped, and capable of both atmospheric and low orbital flight. It was covered in the kind of organic-looking modifications that accumulated on a vessel that had been continuously lived in and worked on for generations, growths and additions, and repairs that layered over each other until the original hull design was more suggestion than fact. It smelled of machine oil and cooking food and something sweet and slightly medicinal that Dace would eventually learn was a natural secretion from the Y'all's skin when they were calm. They weren't hostile. That was the thing he kept coming back to those first days. They weren't warm, exactly. Warmth, he'd learn, was a concept the Y'all expressed primarily through action rather than tone, through small practicalities of care rather than through direct emotional declaration. But they weren't hostile. They fed him. They gave him a bunk in a section of the ship that had clearly been recently cleared out and repurposed for his use, with furniture scaled to something close to his proportions. They brought him a device that, over the course of about 8 hours of patient mutual effort with a young Y'all named Osei, he managed to configure as a rudimentary translation assistant. Osei was the one who explained it to him. "Your device," she said. "The weapon that opened the dimensional crossing, it did not simply transport you. It destabilized the membrane between dimensional layers. Our Earth, this Earth, is the result of a previous destabilization event from your dimension's history. An oscillation event 300 years ago, before either of our civilizations had the concept of dimensions plural. It fused 11 discrete dimensional layers together into one continuous unstable reality." Dace sat with this. "Unstable," he said, profoundly. Osei's outer irises, amber, contracted slightly. He was learning, thoughtfulness, or possibly sadness. The distinction was unclear. Every 11 to 14 years, there is a reality convergence event. 2 or more of the original dimensional layers attempt to re-separate. The physical and biological consequences are catastrophic. Cities destroyed. Geographic features erased or duplicated. Species that existed in only one original layer disappear or are multiplied. We have lost." She paused. "Many people. And you think I can fix it? You are the nexus point. You were in physical contact with an active oscillation device during dimensional crossing. Your presence in this reality creates a localized dimensional anchor. With the right intervention at the right moment and location, you think I can stabilize it, Day said. Or destroy it entirely, OC said. That is the question that divides us. He found out about the second faction 3 days later, in the middle of a firefight over a volcanic plain that he would later learn was called the Shear, a stretch of land along the central continental shelf where the dimensional instability was at its most visible, where the sky above the grounds of fractured echoes of 3 or 4 different versions of itself, stacked like badly shuffled cards. The Kethalomar was running what OC described as a survey mission, cataloging a fresh convergence event when the Drevat ships appeared. They were different from the Yawl ships in the way a predator is different from a farmer. Everything designed for speed and intercept, nothing wasted on the organic accretion of long habitation. The Drevat were from one of the other fused dimensional layers. OC explained quickly while Day strapped into a secondary weapons station that the Yawl had hastily adapted for human-scale use, and they wanted the instability fixed too, but their version of fixed meant using Dace's nexus point resonance to collapse the entire merged reality back to a single original layer, their layer, eliminating everyone and everything from the other 10. Dace thought about this for about 2 seconds. So they want to use me to commit genocide, he said. On an 11-dimensional scale, OC confirmed, he shot first. He wasn't proud of it later, or rather, he was precisely as proud of it as the situation warranted, which was a measured amount, not a triumphant one. He put 2 rounds into the lead Drevat interceptor's drive housing before they'd finished their targeting solution, and in the 6 seconds it took their formation to reassess and adapt, the Kethalomar was already moving. The Yawl's captain, a weathered, tall, extraordinarily calm individual named Chevet, who communicated primarily through a combination of short verbal statements and very precise hand gestures, looked at Dace from across the bridge afterward. You knew, she said. Not accusatory, curious. I guessed, Dace said. I've been in enough tactical situations to know what a capture formation looks like when it's deciding whether to switch to a kill formation. Chevet looked at him with her double iris eyes for a long moment. Our tactical analysts take 11 minutes to model that transition, she said. Dace shrugged. I'm motivated. She almost smiled, he thought. It was hard to be certain. The weeks that followed had a particular texture that Dace would spend years trying to describe accurately and always feel he'd fallen short of. It wasn't adventure. Adventure implied a certain cleanness to the danger, a narrative shape, a sense of trajectory toward resolution. This was more like existing inside a problem that kept generating new subproblems faster than the old ones were solved, while simultaneously learning an alien culture's rules of hospitality and emotional expression and table manners, while also grieving a home he wasn't sure still existed in any form he'd recognize, while also, and this was the part that wrong-footed him the most, finding that he liked these people. The Yawl were strange in ways that mattered and familiar in ways that surprised him. Their consensus cognition in groups was alien enough that he never fully got comfortable with it, the way a room full of them would sometimes pause in near unison before a collective decision, a moment of internal social processing that felt, to an outside observer, like being watched by something with too many eyes. But one-on-one or in small configurations, they were individual in the way that counted. OC's careful, methodical intelligence, her habit of finishing explanations with a question, so that you always had somewhere to put your thinking. Chevet's compressed, bone-dry humor that mostly expressed itself in the precise timing of silences. A mechanic named Jarvo who communicated affection by improving things without being asked. Dace's bunk gained a proper reading light, then a better mattress, then a small shelf that fit his frame perfectly, each improvement appearing without ceremony or expectation of thanks. He thought about Sergeant Fellion's last transmission sometimes. He tried not to. He thought about Lieutenant Commander Vera Costan, his wingman, who'd been 3 kilometers behind him when the anchor device detonated. He tried harder not to think about that. He hadn't found evidence that she'd crossed over with him, and he'd been quietly, systematically asking since the first day, and the Yawl's answer, consistent, gentle, and increasingly obviously honest, was that no second nexus point had registered on their instruments. She hadn't come through. He went to the ship's engine bay when the grief got too heavy, because the engine bay was loud and smelled like hot metal, and the work there, physical, tactile, solvable, was the kind of work that could temporarily occupy the part of his brain that otherwise kept running casualty counts. Jarvo found him there on the 4th night, elbow deep in a recycled coolant conduit that had been running a 3-degree thermal inefficiency that everyone else was willing to tolerate. The mechanic said nothing. sat down nearby, handed Dace a tool without being asked, exactly the right one, and then went back to work on his own project with the specific quality of quiet that says, I know you don't want to talk, and I'm here anyway. Dace thought humans do that too. Not all of them, not always, but the good ones do. He worked in silence for 40 minutes, and when he got the conduit running right, he felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight since the meadow. He was still on Earth, just a different one. In those early weeks, Dace made a study of the Kethalamar the same way he'd always studied environments he needed to survive, in methodically, personally, paying attention to the things that weren't in any briefing document because they'd never had a briefing document. The ship had 7 distinct zones, each with its own social physics. The main deck was formal, navigational, the place where the ship thought about itself as a professional vessel. The engine section was where people went to be useful. The yawl equivalent of clearing your head was to find a mechanical problem and work on it, a fact Dace had arrived at independently and which delighted Osi when he articulated it. The communal eating space, forward of the main deck, was where the ship's social life actually happened, where disputes were resolved and alliances maintained, and the crew's collective mood was set each day. He learned the rhythms of the communal eating space carefully, because food was how the yawl communicated emotional state in ways they didn't put into words. What they ate together, how much they prepared, the specific dishes that appeared in times of stress versus times of ease, these were a language, and if you couldn't read it, you were only half literate in the ship's life. Jarvo was the one who taught him this, mostly, through the mechanism of feeding him, increasingly challenging preparations, and watching his reactions with the focused attention of someone taking notes. The mineral tea was bad. The mineral tea was always bad. He had come to understand that the mineral tea was the yawl's equivalent of black. Coffee, not consumed for pleasure but for function. A metabolic signal booster that did for their biochemistry what caffeine did for his. The fact that it tasted to him like iron filings dissolved in warm salt water was irrelevant to its social significance. When Jarvo handed you the mineral tea, it meant, you are being included in the hard work of this day. You decline it at social cost. He never declined it. There were better things. The bread, flat, dense, made from a grain that grew only in one of the original dimensional layers, and had survived the fusion because 3 centuries of cross-layer pollination had embedded it in the merged ecology, was excellent, with a complex savory sweet quality that reminded him, distantly and imprecisely, of his mother's kitchen. He ate a great deal of bread. Jarvo noticed and started making sure there was always extra. One evening, 3 weeks in, he caught himself eating the bread and drinking the terrible tea, and listening to Osi explain the theoretical framework of dimensional instability, modeling to 2 junior crew members, and Chevette making a precisely timed silence in response to Marev's overlong tactical assessment, and the soft group hum that the yawl sometimes produced in moments of collective ease, a sound like a building settling contentedly after a long day, and he realized he was content, not happy, exactly, not resolved, but present in the specific way that means you are no longer spending your energy on resistance to where you are. He was here. This was the hand he'd been dealt. He was going to play it well. The second thing he did, after accepting this, was go back to the engine bay and fix the thermal inefficiency in the secondary coolant loop that had been nagging at him since the first day. Proper fix this time, not a patch. He worked for 6 hours and used 3 tools he'd improvised from components that weren't designed for each other and emerged with his hands, black with yawl machine lubricant and the conduit running at spec for the first time in what Jarvo's maintenance logs suggest was approximately 4 years. Jarvo examined the repair with the focused silence of an expert evaluating another expert's work, then made the specific sound, short, high, descending, that meant something was inadvisable but impressively done. 4 years, Dace said. Jarvo made a different sound, lower, that the translation device rendered as contextual expression. Resignation, acceptance of oversight. Yeah, Dace said. I get that. They stood in the engine bay for a moment, both looking at the conduit, running right for what was apparently the first time in 4 years. We're going to fix the secondary navigation array next, Dace said. I've been looking at it from the corridor, and something in the tertiary calibration cluster is off. Jarvo made the mineral tea a sound, the gesture of inclusion, the expression of solidarity in difficult work. After dinner, Dace said. Jarvo went to make dinner. Dace went to wash the lubricant off his hands and study the navigation array schematic that Osi had, without being asked, already forwarded to his bunk display. This was how it worked. This was how you built a life. He thought this, standing at the small sink in his quarters. and found it to be true in the way that only simple things can be true, without argument, without reservation, without the need for footnotes. What he had not expected in those early weeks was to find himself becoming something the Y'all did not have a prior category for. They had categories, of course, extensive ones. The Y'all's social taxonomy was ancient and detailed, a record of every kind of person a shipborne nomadic culture could encounter and needed to know how to relate to. Crew, passengers, guest under obligation, guest under gift, enemy combatant, enemy non-combatant, skilled tradesperson, sacred traveler, accidental arrival. Dace fell partially into each of these and entirely into none. He wasn't crew, technically, because he hadn't signed the Y'all's compact of vessel membership, but he worked the ship like crew, with the ship's best interests as a persistent background concern, and after the third week, the crew treated him like crew in the functional ways, the allocation of shared resources, the assumption of reliability, the particular shorthand that develops between people who know each other's capabilities and compensate for each other's limitations without needing to narrate it. He wasn't a guest because guests didn't dismantle and reassemble the tertiary navigation calibration cluster at 2 in the morning because the 12-degree variance was going to cause a targeting error in the next engagement, and someone needed to fix it before that became a problem. He wasn't an enemy, obviously, though the Drevat's continued pursuit meant that his presence on the ship was a tactical liability as well as an asset, and there was at least one conversation that he wasn't supposed to have overheard between Merev and one of the allied vessel representatives, where the word liability appeared several times in an unflattering context. Chevette shut that conversation down with a single, short statement that the translation device rendered as "he is ours," not possessive, relational. He is part of what this ship is. He found out about this secondhand from Osi, who told him with her characteristic precision and an expression that might have been approval. She said that, Dace said. Yes, he sat with it. In Y'all, ours in that context was a specific word that wasn't exactly possessive and wasn't exactly protective. It was closer to the word for something that had been integrated, something whose removal would require reaccounting for everything it had been part of. It was the beginning of the word she would eventually teach him. He was learning what it meant, in practice, before he had the vocabulary for it, which was, he thought, probably the right order. The Drevat made their second move 6 weeks in. This time they came with a fleet, 12 capital ships, a screen of 40 interceptors, and what the Y'all's long-range sensors identified as a dimensional anchor projector of their own design, not identical to the anchor device Dace had ridden through, but derived from the same theoretical lineage, the kind of parallel development you got when two civilizations independently pursued the same physics. Their intent was no longer ambiguous. They were going to force the Nexus Point event manually, using their device to initiate a reality collapse, banking on the ambient resonance of Dace's presence to bias the collapse toward their dimensional layer. 11 dimensions worth of existence collapsed to one, their one. Chevette called a war council. Dace sat at the low table in the Kethalomar's main meeting space, a circular room that always made him feel like he was at the bottom of a well, in the good way, the intimate way, and listened to the Y'all's analysis. Their models were thorough, their tactical assessment was sound, and their conclusion was bleak. "We cannot stop a fleet of 12 capital ships," said the analyst, a wiry old Y'all named Merev who wore the multiple lens scars of someone who'd spent decades looking too closely at dimensional instability events without adequate optical protection. Not with our assets. The Kethalomar and our 3 allied vessels represent perhaps 12% of required defensive mass. "So what's your recommendation?" Dace asked. "Surrender the Nexus Point," Merev said. He wasn't looking at Dace when he said it. "Allow the Drevat to use you. The collapse will be rapid. The survivors." "There won't be survivors," Dace said. "That's not a collapse. That's an erasure. 11 out of 12 dimensional layers, everyone and everything in them. Gone. That's not surrender. That's complicity in a mass extinction." "What is the alternative?" Merev asked. The question was not rhetorical. He actually wanted to know. Dace was quiet for a moment. He'd been thinking about this for 3 days, since the moment the Y'all's sensors first picked up the Drevat fleet on its approach vector. He'd been thinking about it in the engine bay, and during the language sessions with Osei, and in the long night watches when the ship's internal lighting went to its dim blue-gold sleeping mode, and the stars outside the observation ports were the wrong stars in the wrong patterns. He'd been thinking about what Anchor was designed to do, and what it actually did, and what the difference between those two things meant about dimensional physics, and what a human pilot with 200 hours of live fire experience and a working knowledge of the device's technical specifications might be able to do that nobody else in this merged, fractured, beautiful, struggling world had thought of. I have an alternative, he said. It's going to require full access to your dimensional sensing arrays, everything the Kethalomar has. I need the complete convergence history. Every event, every location, every measurement you've taken, for as long as you've been taking measurements. I need Ose, because she's the best analyst on this ship, and I need someone who can tell me when my physics is wrong. And I need Jarvo, because what I'm going to build is going to require someone who can make hardware do things it was never designed to do. Chevette looked at him with her double iris eyes. And what will you build? Dace reached for a stylus and pulled the table's display surface toward him. I'm going to stabilize your world, he said. Not collapse it. Stabilize it. Lock all 11-dimensional layers into permanent coherence. No more convergence events. No more erasures. One Earth, built from all 11. The silence in the room had a specific weight. That has never been theorized as possible, Marev said. That's because you've been thinking about it from the wrong direction, Dace said. You've been trying to undo the original oscillation event. Go backward to a stable state. But you can't undo it. The 11 layers have been fused for 3 centuries. They've evolved together. They're not separable anymore without catastrophic loss. I'm not going to try to undo it. I'm going to go forward. Complete the fusion. Turn 11 incompletely merged layers into one fully integrated coherent reality. The oscillation device didn't just break something. It started a process. I'm going to finish it. Another silence. Osi was the one who broke it. She said, the energy requirement for a complete dimensional integration event would be, and then she stopped because she was doing the calculation in real time and the number was arriving and her outer irises were contracting rapidly. I know, Dace said. That is not. She stopped again. I know. The nexus point resonance would need to be absolute center of the integration field. You would be. I know, he said for the 3rd time, and said it with enough quiet finality that she stopped pushing on it. Chevette said, we do not ask this of you. I know you don't, Dace said. I'm volunteering. The build took 11 days. They worked around the clock, Dace and Jarvo and 2 of Jarvo's most trusted crew, plus Osi running continuous theoretical support from the analysis bay, plus 3 Y'all engineers from the allied vessels who'd been cleared in on the project by Chevette's direct authority. The Drevat fleet was 12 days out on its current approach vector. They had, if the math held, approximately 1 day of margin. The first 3 days were theory. Dace sat with Osi in the analysis bay from first light to well past the ship's nighttime cycle, working through the physics of the integration concept on a display surface covered in diagrams and scribbled corrections, and, by the end of day 2, a growing library of things that didn't work that was far larger than the library of things that might. Osi was rigorous in a way that initially frustrated him. Every time he proposed an approach, she would work through it completely before offering a response, and her responses were rarely no, but were often yes. But the energy load at this stage exceeds available output by a factor of 7, which was structurally similar to no, but left you a path forward if you could find the 7-factor reduction. He found the 7-factor reduction on the morning of day 3, while eating bread and drinking the terrible tea, when it occurred to him that he'd been modeling the integration event as a single instantaneous process when the physics actually supported a staged resonance cascade, not one enormous push, but 11 small ones, each one using the energy output of the previous to initiate the next, like tipping the first in a chain of resonating frequencies. The math on a stage cascade was almost achievable. Not quite, but almost. Osi spent 40 minutes checking his math. Then she said, very quietly, there is a way to close the remaining gap. He knew, from the way she said it, what the way was. The nexus point resonance, he said. Your cellular integration with the dimensional fabric of this reality means your biological field can function as the initiating resonator for the first stage. You don't need to generate the energy, you already are the energy. The device amplifies it, focuses it, directs it. But the source is me, he said. Yes. She looked at him directly, which was the Y'all way of communicating that this was an important moment and they were not going to look away from it. The initiation phase will draw on your nexus point resonance at full capacity. The modeling suggests this is, she stopped, probably fatal, he said. The probability range is broad, she said carefully. 53 to 81% chance of fatal neural cascade from the resonance draw. 15 to 30% chance of non-fatal but significant neurological damage. The remaining probability range is that I'm fine. Is that you survive without permanent damage, yes. The range is 6 to 32% depending on the precision of the device calibration and the specific timing of the integration cascade. He nodded. He did the math in his head. The familiar, flat arithmetic of probability that a military career trains you to do quickly and without flinching, because the number doesn't change based on how you feel about it. 6 to 32%, roughly 1 in 4 averaged, versus 11-dimensional layers worth of lives erased by a Drevat fleet that had no intention of stopping. I can do the math from here, he said. I know, OC said. I wanted you to have the number. Thank you, he said. He meant it. She went back to the display. He finished his tea. They worked for another 14 hours. The next 8 days were construction, and the construction was the hardest, and in some ways the best thing Dace had ever been part of. There was a quality to work undertaken in the knowledge that it has to succeed. Not the brittle, high-stakes anxiety of desperate improvisation, but something cleaner and more fundamental. The quality of a group of people who have decided to do a thing and are doing it with everything they have, no reservation held back for a different future, because there is no different future to hold it for. Jarvo was magnificent. Dace had known the mechanic was skilled. The Kethalomar's functional state was a daily testimony to that, but skill operating under constraint is different from skill given a genuine problem to solve, and the genuine problem produced a version of Jarvo that was fully present in a way that daily maintenance didn't require. Every component they needed and didn't have was fabricated from something that could be made to work. Every material property that was wrong for the application was compensated for by redesigning the application. Every junction that wouldn't hold under the energy loads the device required was re-engineered until it would. At the end of day 6, Dace looked at what they'd built. Attached to the frame of the Kethalomar's forward sensor array, dense and asymmetrical and covered in Jarvo's characteristic hand notations, indicating the purpose of each non-standard component, and thought about how it looked like 11 different things that had been forced into coherence by someone who refused to accept that coherence wasn't possible. He thought this was appropriate. He thought about the Keth Alamar itself, about its 7 decades of accumulated modifications, about the way it looked like every repair decision had been made in the moment with the best available material and then become part of the ship's permanent self. He thought about the integrated Earth above them, 3 centuries of 11-dimensional layers pressing against each other and being pressed back, all that unresolved pressure becoming the landscape itself, becoming the complex geology of a world that had more history in its rocks than any single civilization's science could easily catalog. He thought about a body that could be a resonance initiator because it had survived a dimensional crossing event. He thought about how the universe didn't care about your origin materials. It cared about what you'd been shaped into by everything that had happened to you. He thought he might be all right with that. On the last night, the night before the Drevat fleet arrived, when the device was complete and checked again, and there was nothing left to do but wait, the Kethalomar's crew gathered in the communal space. Not formally. Not with ceremony, just gradually over the course of an hour, until everyone was there, Dace and Osi and Chevette and Jarvo and Merev and the junior crew and the 3 engineers from the allied vessels who stayed on board to be there for the attempt. Jarvo cooked. Not the mineral tea, not the standard ration, the good bread, plus 3 other preparations that Dace had eaten less than a handful of times, the ones that appeared only on occasions when the ship's communal emotional register was operating at its most sincere register. They ate together. They talked. Merev told a story about a convergence event he'd survived 30 years ago. Not graphic, just honest. The kind of story that carries within it the weight of everything that was at stake. One of the junior crew, young, whose name translated roughly as Swiftwaiter, sang something, a yawl song, tonal and structured, with the same quality as the collective hum, but more deliberate, more personal. Dace listened to it and felt the hair on his arm stand up, not in the threat-warning way, but in the way that music does when it lands directly in the part of you that can't be armored. When it ended, O.C. looked at him. He understood the look. He hummed. The melody, his mother's, circular, short, folding back into its own beginning. He hummed it quietly in the communal space of the Keth Alamar, with the wrong stars outside the ports, and the Drevat fleet somewhere out in the dark, and the device built and ready and all the math already done. He hummed it and felt it land in his own chest the way it always did. Adjacent to grief, but not identical to it. When he finished, the room was quiet. Swiftwaiter said, carefully, "What is that?" "It's a song my mother sang when I was small," he said. "I don't remember the words, just the melody. It sounds like a returning," Swiftwaiter said. "The melody, it goes away and comes back, like a ship's path." He thought about this. "I never thought of it that way," he said. "But yes, exactly like that. Chevette from across the room made the compressed silence that was her version of a raised glass. The room held it, for a moment, that particular quality of shared quiet that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something that doesn't need it. Then Jarvo handed him the mineral tea, and he drank it without flinching, and they sat together in the warm, dim light of the Kethalomar's evening cycle for another hour, and when people drifted to their bunks, it was the way people drift to sleep before a necessary day, not escapist but practical, storing rest for the morning. Dace stayed in the communal space after the others left, in the specific way he always did when his brain needed to process something before sleep was available to it. He sat in the particular chair he'd come to regard as his. Nobody had assigned it. It had just become his through the ordinary mechanism of consistent use, the way spaces personalize themselves around persistent presences. He thought about the probability range, 6 to 32%. He thought about what it meant to be one who cannot be removed without recalculating everything. He thought about the conference he'd want to call, after, if after existed. He thought about what the integrated Earth was going to need in the years after stability, when the political pressures that the convergence events had been holding in suspension started moving again. He thought about a great many things. He put them in the mental folder where things go when you've looked at them fully and accepted them, and no longer need to carry them at the front of your mind. Then he went to sleep, in his bunk with Jarvo's shelf and its reading light, and slept without dreaming, until the ship's systems woke him, with the quiet tone that meant morning watch was beginning, and everything was about to happen. He had time to drink 1 cup of the terrible tea before the Drevat fleet came over the Shear's horizon. The device was ready. So was he. The device they built was not pretty. It wasn't supposed to be. It was built into the frame of the Kethalomar's forward sensor array housing, which meant it was effectively a one-shot modification. You used it, and the sensor array was gone, and possibly a significant portion of the forward hull as well. Jarvo expressed this architectural concern by holding up the relevant structural diagram and making a specific sound, high, short, descending, that Dace had come to recognize as the yawl equivalent of "this is deeply inadvisable, but I understand why we're doing it, and I will give you the best version of the inadvisable thing I can." "I know," Dace said again. He was saying that a lot lately. At night, the ship's night, the biological reset time, when the yawl went to their shared sleeping arrangements, and the corridors went quiet and blue. He sat in the observation bay and looked at the wrong stars. He thought about the meadow. He thought about the specific quality of the blue-green grass, the way it had moved in waves. He thought about Vera Costin, whose call sign had been Lich, because she had the habit of latching onto a tactical solution once she'd found it and riding it all the way down, regardless of what developed around her. He hoped she was alive. He hoped the dimensional shear had been clean enough that she'd gone somewhere, not nowhere. He thought about what Earth was supposed to look like, and found that the image in his memory was less sharp than it used to be. He could still see it, still feel its weight. The specific blue of the Cascadian sky, the weight of standard gravity, his mother's apartment with its view of the bay, the way the water looked at dusk when the industrial lights were coming on across the harbor. He could still feel all of it, but when he held it up against this Earth, this merged, complicated, 11-layered thing full of yawl consensus cognition and Drevat aggression and blue-green grass and double iris eyes and mechanics who expressed care through practical improvement, he found that "supposed to" was doing less work in the sentence than it used to. He wasn't going home. He'd known this for weeks. The Oscillation event had been a one-way door, and even if he completed the integration and survived, which the math suggested was unlikely, a probability he'd been very careful not to share with OC. The resulting reality would be a new thing, neither his Earth nor theirs, but something that contained elements of both in a way that physics didn't currently have a vocabulary for. He was never going back to Cascadia. He was never going to see the harbor at dusk. He found that he was all right with this, not happy with it, not at peace with it in any clean, resolved way. But all right, the kind of all right that comes from looking at a very large thing clearly, without flinching and deciding that looking at it clearly is the only dignity available. OC found him there, near the end of the second night watch. She sat down beside him, close, which was a yawl gesture of deliberate connection, since their default social spacing was wider than humans, and looked at the stars with him for a while. Eventually she said, "You hum." He blinked. "What?" "When you work, when you are in the engine bay or running the device calibrations, you make a sound, tonal, repeated." She demonstrated, not badly actually, a rough approximation of something he'd apparently been doing without noticing. "It's called humming," he said. What does it mean? He thought about it. Nothing specific. He searched for the right word and didn't entirely find it. It's a way of keeping yourself company, I think. Human brains don't like silence when the hands are busy, so you make a sound. It doesn't mean anything, it just fills the space. OC was quiet for a moment. Your kind makes sounds that mean nothing? All the time, he said. Music. We make whole art forms out of organized sounds that don't directly mean anything. Turns out that's more important to us than most things. She thought about this with the particular quality of y'all attention that felt like a door opening inward. What is the one you hum most often? He had to think. It took a moment to surface, because it was the kind of thing that ran below conscious awareness, in the operational background of the brain that keeps the lights on while the thinking parts are busy elsewhere. When it came up, it surprised him a little. My mother used to sing it, he said. When I was small. I don't even remember all the words, just the melody. He hummed it for her, quietly, there in the observation bay with the wrong stars and the distant iridescent shimmer of dimensional instability on the horizon. It was a short melody, circular, the kind that folds back into its own beginning. He hummed it and felt something move in his chest that wasn't grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the way a shadow is adjacent to the thing casting it. When he finished, Osi said nothing for a while. Then she said, I think I understand why your kind makes sounds that mean nothing. He looked at her. Why? Because they mean everything, she said. Just not in language. He didn't have an answer for that. He was pretty sure she was right. The Drevet fleet came over the Shear's horizon on the morning of the 13th day. 12 capital ships, 40 interceptors. The dimensional anchor projector slung beneath the lead capital's ventral hull like a weapon that was also a statement. I have already decided how this ends, and I have built the machine to prove it. Dace was in the forward section of the Kethalomar, strapped into the operator's cradle they'd installed for the integration device. Around him, wired into every available junction and surface, was 11 days of work, the physical manifestation of a theory that hadn't existed until 3 weeks ago, built from components that hadn't been designed for this purpose, by people who were making it up as they went along, because the situation demanded making it up and making it up well. Drevat fleet at combat range in 4 minutes. Marev's voice came through the ship's internal channels, flat and professional, hiding whatever was underneath the professionalism. Acknowledged, Dace said. Integration device calibrations are stable, Osi said from the analysis bay. Her voice was doing the same thing, professionalism over something else. Something she'd told him 2 nights ago was called Thelvar, a y'all concept for which she said the closest human translation was probably the feeling of standing next to something larger than you while it changes. Copy, Dace said, Captain Harrow. Chevette's voice from the bridge. Brief, as always, Captain Shavit. The Allied vessels will engage the Drevat interceptors to provide time. It will not be sufficient time unless the device works quickly. Understood, a pause. Then Chevette said, in the particular tone of voice she used for things that mattered, This has been a good ship to have you on. Dace thought of Jarvo's shelf. He thought of Osi's questions at the end of every explanation. He thought of Chevette's compressed silences and Marev's scarred eyes and 40 days of trying to do right by a world that wasn't his and finding out somewhere along the way that it was. It's been a good ship to be on, he said. The Drevat opened fire 30 seconds later. The battle, if you could call the asymmetrical, brutal, deeply unequal engagement of 4 light yawl vessels against a fleet of 12 capital ships a battle, which Dace thought was perhaps being generous, lasted 9 minutes. The Allied vessels fought brilliantly. He could see it on the tactical display in the operator's cradle, even while his hands were on the integration device's primary controls, running the final calibration sequences. The Yawl used their knowledge of the local dimensional geography the way a home team uses a stadium, not with more power, but with more precision, threading their intercept vectors through the convergence zones, where Drevat targeting systems glitched slightly, drawing fire into sectors where the dimensional instability bent the energy dispersal in unexpected ways. It bought time. Not quite enough time. One of the Allied vessels was destroyed, the Methoron, a smaller ship that had been running the most aggressive intercept profile, gone in a flash of released drive energy that left a dark smear on the tactical display that nobody on the Kethalomar said anything about because there wasn't anything to say. Good people had just died. More would if this didn't work. Anchor projector is powering up, Marev reported. Drevat primary capital, ventral housing, integration in approximately 90 seconds. Copy, Dace said. Beginning integration sequence. The device did not make the kind of noise he'd expected. He'd expected power, drama, the sound of something enormous being set in motion. Instead, it made a low harmonic resonance that he felt more than heard. In his teeth, in the base of his skull, in his sternum, in whatever the Yal had identified as nexus point resonance in his cellular structure. The sound that the universe makes when you push on it and it decides to push back in a different direction. The dimensional mapping display lit up around him. 11 layers, color-coded, their edges and overlaps and fault lines laid out in a holographic sphere that surrounded the operator's cradle like a nest of light. 300 years of fusion, incomplete and unstable, bleeding through the years in periodic catastrophic bursts. And at the center, barely visible, the original oscillation event, the ancestor of what Dace had ridden through, a wound in the fabric of reality that had been trying and failing to heal itself for 3 centuries. He put his hands on the primary controls and thought about what Osi had said. They mean everything, just not in language. He started humming. He hummed the melody his mother had sung, the short, circular one that folded back into its beginning, and his hands moved through the integration sequence on the primary controls, and the device's resonance matched his own nexus point resonance in a way that the theory had predicted, but that he hadn't entirely believed until the moment he felt it happen. A click of alignment, like a key into lock, like 2 broken edges finding each other in the dark. The Drevat anchor projector fired. It was a massive thing. It hit the local dimensional fabric like a hammer, driving toward the nexus point resonance in Dace's cellular structure, trying to use that resonance as a lever to pry the 11 layers apart and collapse them toward a single origin. It was powerful. It was precisely the right kind of force for the job it was designed to do. What it wasn't designed for was Dace's device, already running, already integrated, already using his nexus point resonance, not as a lever but as a seed crystal, not pulling the dimensional layers apart but drawing them together, using the Drevat's enormous collapsing force as additional input energy, redirecting it the way a judo throw redirects a charge, taking the weapon aimed at erasure and making it into the final push toward integration. He learned later from OC that the energy release was visible from 500 kilometers. What he experienced at the time was less visual. It was more like every bone in his body ringing simultaneously, every nerve firing at once, not in pain exactly, but in something beyond the pain-pleasure spectrum, something that language hadn't been built to contain. The 11-dimensional layers, 3 centuries of incomplete fusion, completed all at once, not with a tearing sound, but with a harmonic resolution, a chord struck, hanging in the air, the kind of sound that means things have settled into where they were always going. And then it was quiet. He was still there. He had not, as the math had suggested was likely, ceased to exist. He had not expected this, and sat with the unexpectedness of it for a long moment, breathing steadily, running his hands over his arms and face in the universal human gesture of checking that you're still assembled. The dimensional mapping display had gone dark, not damaged. There was nothing left to map. 11 layers had become one. The shear, outside the observation ports, had stopped shimmering. Ozi, he said. Here. Her voice, steady. There was something in it he hadn't heard before. Tell me what happened, a pause. Not the Yalkan consensus pause, but a personal one. The pause of someone finding words for something they hadn't expected to need words for. The integration is complete, OC said. Full dimensional coherence, no residual convergence probability, no fault lines. The modeling engine cannot find any remaining instability. Another pause, it worked. Dace leaned back in the operator's cradle and looked at the ceiling of the forward section, which was the same battered, lived-in, over-modified ceiling it had always been, scarred with the marks of decades of maintenance, and the odd collision and the particular creativity of people who kept a ship running through stubbornness and ingenuity rather than adequate resourcing. Good, he said. The Drevat fleet had stopped firing. The battle analysis, coming through in Marev's careful reporting over the following minutes, told the story. The collapse of their anchor projector's target, the dimensional instability that the nexus point resonance had been anchored within, had triggered a cascade failure in the projector itself, taking out the primary capital ship's drive systems. The fleet was adrift. Its tactical situation was, to use a precise military term, over. It wasn't a surrender exactly. It was more like a clarification. The Drevat had come to collapse a dimensional reality and use its erasure as a foundation for absolute power. The dimensional reality had been integrated instead, and the Drevat's primary weapon had destroyed itself in the attempt to prevent that. The war wasn't over, wars that deep rarely end in a single battle, but the specific existential crisis that had been pointed at 11 worlds, worth of lives had been for now turned aside. Dace unstrapped himself from the operator's cradle. His legs were unsteady, not injury, Just the aftermath of being a biological conductor for an event of that magnitude, and he held the side rail for a moment, breathing. Jarvo appeared in the doorway of the forward section. The mechanic looked at Dace, then at the integration device, then back at Dace, and made a sound that Dace had never heard a Y'all make before. Short, high, with a quality that he could only describe as released. Is that? Dace started. Yarvo crossed the space between them and put both arms around him in the specific way that the Y'all never did. That wasn't a Y'all gesture at all. That the Keth Alomar's crew had clearly been watching him do with himself during moments of solitude in the engine, over the past weeks, and had apparently decided to borrow. It was a hug. An alien had learned to hug from watching him, and was now using it on him. He stood there for a moment, completely unprepared for this. Then he laughed. Not the controlled, managing laugh of someone who needs to appear at ease, but a real one, the kind that has some crying mixed into its edges, because the body needs to release things that don't fit in any single category. He laughed, and Jarvo held on, and through the observation port in the forward section, the sky of the newly integrated Earth was clearing to a color that had never existed in any single one of its 11 source dimensions, a color that was all of them and none of them, and precisely itself. Chevette found him 2 hours later on the observation deck, where he'd been since Jarvo let go of him, sitting with his back against the outer wall and his knees drawn up, watching the sky. She sat down next to him in the close way that meant deliberate connection. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the sky of the integrated Earth. Below the shear, which was shearing no longer, just land, complex and rich and layered in ways that would take geologists decades to fully map, the physical record of 300 years of 11 worlds trying to become one. In the distance, the remains of the Drevat fleet, drifting without power, its crews alive and contained and waiting for whatever came next. You thought you wouldn't survive, Chevette said. Not a question. The math suggested it was unlikely, Dace said. And yet, Chevette was quiet again. The Y'all version of quiet had different textures. Dace had learned to read some of them. This one was the texture of something being carefully considered. There is no path back to your origin dimension, she said. No. You are aware that you have permanently altered the physics of this reality in a way that makes you its effective anchor. Your nexus point resonance is now. She paused, looking for the precise word. Integrated. You are not merely in this world. You are part of what holds it together. Dace thought about this. He'd known it, abstractly, from the theory. Hearing it said plainly was different. Does that bother you, he asked, because the question felt fair to ask. Chevette considered it. It is a large thing to carry, she said. Yes, you are carrying it. Seems like it. Another silence. Then Chevette said, on the Keth Alamar, when someone becomes part of the crew in a permanent way, when the ship's systems are calibrated to account for them, when the supply manifests are adjusted, when the long watches include them as a matter of course, there is a term we use. What is it? Dace asked. She told him. It was a long word in Y'all, with internal harmonics that his vocal apparatus wasn't quite built to reproduce precisely, but he tried, and she made the small correction, and he tried again, and she made a sound that he was almost certain was the Y'all equivalent of approval. What does it mean, he asked. It means, Chevette said, one who was not here and then was, who cannot now be removed without recalculating everything. Dace sat with that. The sky continued to clear. The color it was becoming had no name in any language that either of them knew. It was going to need one, and they were both going to be here to give it. The first convergence survey was completed 6 months later. OC led it, 3 vessels, 40-day circuit, comprehensive dimensional stability mapping across all 11 previously distinct geographic regions. Dace went along, partly as nexus point technical presence. His resonance signature made the survey instruments significantly more sensitive at the margins, where residual instability, if any existed, would first appear, partly because he'd found that stillness and he were not well suited to extended proximity. The survey found nothing. No residual convergence probability, no fault lines, no fraying at the edges, one integrated, coherent, stable reality. OC spent 3 days running the data again from scratch because 3 centuries of instability doesn't simply resolve itself. And the scientific part of her brain was apparently programmed to distrust any result this clean. The data came back the same 3 times. On the 4th pass she stopped, looked at the results, and made a sound that Dace recognized. He'd heard it from her before, in small private moments, when a problem resolved in a way that was more elegant than expected. It's real, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him. How long have you known? Since about 5 minutes after it happened, he paused. I felt it, not analytically. Just the way you know when a machine is running right. The quality of the vibration changes. This one changed. OC was quiet. Then, very precisely, you felt dimensional integration with your body. I had a lot of its resonance frequency in me at that point, he said. I figured I'd get some feedback. Captain Harrow, she said, with an expression he'd come to recognize as the Y'all version of exasperated affection. Lieutenant Osei, he said. She picked up her stylus and went back to her report, and he went back to the engine bay, where Jarvo was installing a new coolant routing system that was definitely going to need a human's awkwardly sized hands to access the secondary junction, and the survey ship cut its way through the clear, statable sky of the integrated Earth, and somewhere below them, 11 worlds worth of people were getting on with the work of becoming one world together, which was going to take a very long time and be extremely complicated and require enormous amounts of patience and compromise from everyone involved. Dace thought they'd manage it. People generally did when the alternative was made sufficiently clear. He hummed in the engine bay. The old melody, circular, folding back into itself. Yarvo, on the other side of the coolant housing, after a moment hummed it back, imperfectly, slightly off the original intervals, with a Y'all vocal quality that made it sound like something new. Dace listened to the difference between the original and the version Jarvo was making, and thought about 11 dimensions, integrating into one color that had never existed in any of them individually. He adjusted his pitch slightly, toward the version Jarvo was singing. Something between the two of them hung in the air of the engine bay, warming with the heat of the machinery, making a sound that meant nothing and everything. Below, the surface of the world that had been broken and was no longer. Above, a sky that was learning its own new color. Dace Harrow, Cascadian Free Forces, serial number CF44 Delta, Nexus Point, one who was not here, and then was and cannot now be removed without recalculating everything. He kept working, kept humming, kept doing the specific small thing that the moment required. It was enough. It was exactly enough. 3 months after the integration, the political situation clarified itself in the way that political situations always clarify themselves eventually. Not cleanly, not all at once, but gradually, like sediment settling in water, the distinct layers becoming visible over time. The integrated Earth had 11 former governments, 11 former militaries, 11 economic systems, 11 sets of territorial claims, 11 cultural traditions, 11 species-level assumptions about how things were supposed to work. The dimensional convergence events had, for 3 centuries, prevented any of these from fully resolving into dominance. Every time one layer began to establish meaningful authority over another, a convergence event would reshuffle the geography and reset the political calculus. The instability had been catastrophic, yes, but it had also been a kind of enforced equality of suffering. Nobody had come out ahead because nobody could. Now the instability was gone. The playing field, for the first time in 3 centuries, was level and permanent, which meant, for the first time in 3 centuries, the question of whose field it was going to be was live in a way it had been before. Dace watched this develop from the Kethalomar's bridge displays with the specific feeling of someone watching a situation they'd been involved in, creating start to generate consequences they hadn't fully modeled. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said to Chauvet. She was standing at the main navigation display, looking at the distribution of Yal, Shiel, and Chilam, and 3 other fused-dimensional civilizations, military assets across the newly integrated landmass. "You're not wrong," she said. "The convergence events kept any one group from consolidating power. Yes. Now they can consolidate. Yes. And you're telling me this isn't already a political crisis in progress." Chauvet looked at him. "I am not telling you that," she said. "I have said nothing about a political crisis." "Your silence is very loud," he said. She almost smiled. "I am a quiet person." He pulled up the asset distribution himself and spent an hour going through it with Osei's help because Osei's analytical precision caught the implications that his less trained eye missed. What they found was, 3 of the 11 former layers' political structures were accelerating military asset consolidation at a rate that suggested preparation rather than defense. The Muyal Collective, one of the most technologically advanced of the 11, a hive-structured civilization from a dimension where evolution had taken biological consensus further than anywhere else, had been moving their manufacturing capacity toward a single geographic concentration for 6 weeks. The Talvanshar, a militarized industrial civilization from a dimension that had developed fusion energy before wheels, were doing something similar on the northern continental shelf. And the Drevat, whose fleet was still largely intact and now repositioned from its defeat, were quiet in a way that Osei's model identified as resource gathering, not stand down. "Everyone's about to try to run the table," Day said. "It is the logical response to a newly stable environment," Osei said. 300 years of prevented consolidation creates enormous pent-up political pressure. Remove the constraint, and everybody moves at once. He stared at the display, which means they move against each other. The models suggest a high probability of significant conflict within 18 months if current consolidation rates hold. Dace leaned back in his chair. He thought about the integration. He thought about the cost of it, in the Metheron and its crew, in the people who died in 3 centuries of convergence events, in the Drevats dead after the battle. He thought about what it would mean if the integrated Earth they'd just stabilized broke itself apart in a different way, not dimensional, just ordinary, human or human-adjacent political violence, the kind that every civilization, with power asymmetries and long memories, managed to generate eventually. He thought about it for a long time. Then he went to find Chevette. She was in the captain's berth, which was the smallest private space on the ship, which Dace had come to understand was a y'all cultural statement about leadership. The captain's quarters were the least comfortable, because the captain's job was to make everyone else's quarters comfortable. He knocked. She said, "Come. I need to do something that is technically outside my authority," he said. Chevette looked at him with her double iris eyes. "You say this as if it is the first time," she said. "I want to call a conference," he said. "All 11 former layer governing bodies. Neutral ground. Before anyone launches anything. On whose authority? Mine," he said it flatly. "I'm the nexus point. I'm why the integration happened. I have no official standing in any government in this reality, which means I have no faction, which means I might be the only person in this merged world that most of the 11 governing bodies might actually talk to without assuming it's a tactical maneuver." Chevette was quiet. "The Thalamar has no authority to convene," she began. "I know. The Drevat alone could refuse to participate, and I know your probability of success is, I know," he said it a third time. "But I've done the math, and this is the option most likely to get the best outcome for the most people. And when I get to that point in my analysis, I stop second-guessing and I commit. You've watched me do this before." Chevette looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I will plot courses." He sent the invitations, all 11. He sent them from his own nexus point resonance frequency, which the Y'all's communication systems could encode as a verifiable identifier, the dimensional equivalent of a fingerprint, the proof that this was coming from the one person in this reality whose presence was technically woven into the physics of it. He figured most of the governing bodies knew that detail by now. He figured it would get the messages opened. It did. 11 responses, over 48 hours, 9 acceptances, 1 refusal from the Muyal collective, then a reversal when the Muyal apparently recalculated their position after seeing the 9 acceptances, and 1 delayed response from the Drevat that said, in the translation, something that resolved as, "We will attend to observe. We do not commit to participation." Dace wrote back, "That is all I ask." The conference took place on the sheer. Dace had chosen it deliberately, the flat, formerly shimmering plane, where the dimensional instability had been most visibly concentrated, the place where 11 layers had been most obviously, most catastrophically present in each other's space. It looked different now. The shimmer was gone. The sky above it was then Verkai, calm and extraordinary, and the land itself was complex in its geology, in a way that geologists from 4 different civilizations were going to spend generations unraveling. But it stood still and it held still, and it was unambiguously one place. He stood at the center of the neutral space that Kethalomar had landed and marked, watching the ships come in. 11 delegations, 11 sets of visual signals indicating their civilization of origin, flags and frequency markers and biological pheromone gradients, and, in the case of the Muyal, a distinctive electromagnetic signature that their collective biology broadcast as identification. Chevette stood beside him. Osi was 20 meters to his left with a documentation team. Jarvo was back on the ship, doing maintenance that didn't need to be done, which was how Jarvo handled situations he couldn't help with directly. The Drevat delegation was last. Deepwater Memory stepped off the ramp, looked at the assembled representatives of 10 other civilizations, and then looked at Dace. "You actually got them all here," she said. 11 dimensions had the same idea when they hit the same problem, he said. It turns out they weren't that different. She looked at the sky, at Thenverkai. "What are you going to say to them?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about the engineering sergeant's abort call and the 4-second window. He thought about the meadow, the breathing blue-green grass. He thought about what the Kethalomar's word for belonging meant, one who was not here and then was, who cannot now be removed without recalculating everything. "I'm going to say that they've all spent 300 years trying to hold their individual dimensional layers together," he said. and they failed because they were going the wrong direction. I'm going to say that integrated complexity is not a problem to be solved, it's a state to be inhabited. And I'm going to say that I know, personally, in my own cellular structure, that you can't undo the fusion. You can only go forward into it. Deepwater memory was quiet. And you think they'll listen? I think they'll argue, he said, extensively, for a very long time. I think there will be follow-up conferences and long diplomatic processes, and at least 2 near breakdowns, and possibly 1 actual small-scale conflict that will have to contain and eventually resolve, and the whole thing will take decades. Then what is the point of this? He looked at her directly. The point is to start. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "You would not have a dimension left to go home to if this fails." "I don't have a dimension to go home to regardless," he said. "I told you. I'm integrated. This is my home." She looked at him, at the assembled delegations, at the sky. She turned and walked toward the conference ground, and Dace watched her go, and then he turned to Chevette. "Ready?" he said. "I have been ready," Chevette said, "since you called it inevitable." He nodded. He walked toward the center of the assembled civilizations, into the first conversation that was going to take decades, toward an outcome that nobody could predict, and everybody was going to have to build together. He was humming. He wasn't aware of it until O.C. caught his eye from 20 meters away and gave him the specific look she reserved for when he did something, recognizably human in a way that she found simultaneously baffling and precise. He kept humming anyway. The conference lasted 11 days. It nearly failed on day 3, when the Talvanshar delegation walked out over a territorial mapping dispute that had 300-year roots and 5 layers of compounded grievance. Dace went after them personally, without ceremony, and sat with the chief Talvanshar negotiator for 4 hours in a supply shelter at the edge of the landing field, while a light rain came in from the north, real rain, falling on stable ground, which still felt like a small miracle to everyone who'd lived through the convergence events. He didn't try to resolve the territorial dispute. He wasn't qualified to resolve the territorial dispute. He just asked the negotiator questions, careful, genuine questions, the kind O.C. had taught him by example, and listened to the answers, and eventually the negotiator was talking about things that weren't the dispute at all, but were underneath it. 3 centuries of watching their civilization be shredded and reassembled and shredded again, the specific grief of a culture that had been denied the ability to simply exist continuously, to have an uninterrupted history. "I know something about interrupted histories," Dace said. The negotiator looked at him. "Yours was interrupted by your own weapon," she said. Not unkindly, just precisely. "I know." A long silence, the rain on the shelter roof. Somewhere in the middle distance, the sounds of the other delegations continuing their work. "What do you do with it?" the negotiator asked. The interruption. He thought about Vera Costain, about Cascadian harbors at dusk, about the gap between the life he'd had and the life he was living. "You don't undo it," he said. "You find out what you can build from where you ended up." The Talvanshar delegation came back on day 4. The conference reached its first agreement on day 9. A framework document, 6 pages, containing nothing binding and everything necessary. 11 signatures from 11 civilizations, acknowledging in formal language what Dace had said informally on the sheer, that the integrated Earth was their shared reality, that no single civilization's origin dimension had precedent claim over any others, and that the path forward required all of them moving in the same direction. It wasn't a peace treaty. It wasn't a constitution. It was closer to a statement of direction, a commitment to the process rather than a prescription for the outcome. 11 civilizations saying, formally, "We're going to try." Deepwater memory signed for the Drevat. She looked at the document for a long time before she signed it, and Dace watched her look at it, and thought that some decisions have to be sat with before they can be made, and that this was one of them, and that sitting with it was not weakness but accuracy. She signed. The conference ended on day 11. The delegations left in 1s and 2s, ships lifting from the sheer into the Thenverkai sky. Dace stood at the edge of the landing field with Chevette and O.C. and Jarvo, watching them go. Jarvo handed him a cup of the mineral tea. He took it without thinking, the way you take something handed to you by someone whose offerings have become part of your day. He drank half of it, and remembered halfway through that it tasted terrible to his physiology. He finished the cup. The Drevat envoy came 8 months after the battle. Dace was in the Kethalomar's main docking bay when the shuttle came in, a single vessel, minimal crew, a white indicator light running along the hull that the Yawl's diplomatic protocols apparently recognized as a formal non-hostility signal. He stood to one side with Chevette and watched the hatch open and watched the envoy come down the ramp. She was tall. "Drevat," Clearly, the same biology as the soldiers who'd come to erase 11 worlds, but wearing no armor, carrying nothing that looked like a weapon, and with an expression on her face that translated across species lines without any difficulty at all. It was the expression of someone who has lost a large argument with themselves and come out the other side of it. Her name, in translation, was something like Deepwater Memory. She was a secondary cultural officer from the Drevat upper administrative structure, not a military figure, which Marev pointed out quietly meant she'd been sent not to negotiate surrender terms, but to begin something that required a different kind of authority. She looked at Dace for a moment, in the specific way that all the Drevet he'd encountered in the battle looked at him, with that flat, tactical assessment, and then something in her face shifted. "You're the one who did the integration," she said. "The translation device rendered it in serviceable standard Meridian. I had help," Dace said. "The Y'all didn't have the theory. They had everything else." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want?" Deepwater Memory was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "To understand how you decided." Dace blinked. "Decided what? To stabilize, not collapse. Every model we ran, every model any of the 11-layer civilizations has ever run, when they found the theory at all, concluded that integration was impossible. The energy requirement alone was calculated as fatal to any nexus point conductor. You had every reason to believe you were choosing your own death over a result that our models said couldn't be achieved." She paused. "How did you decide?" He thought about it. He thought about the engineer's call to abort and the 4-second window and the choice to improvise anyway. He thought about a meadow with blue-green grass. He thought about Osi's questions at the end of every explanation, always leaving room for you to put your thinking. He thought about Jarvo's shelf. He thought about Chevette's compressed silences and the word for someone who cannot be removed without recalculating everything. He thought about a melody that folded back into its own beginning. He thought about Vera Costain, call sign Latch, who had the habit of latching onto a tactical solution and riding it all the way down. "I didn't decide," he said. "Not the way you mean. I assessed the situation, and I picked the response most likely to get the best outcome for the most people, and then I committed to it completely. That's not philosophy. That's training." Deepwater Memory looked at him for a long moment. "Your training encompasses willingness to die for the lives of 11-dimensional layers worth of beings who are not your species," she said. "When you put it that way, it sounds unusual," he said. "But yeah, roughly. Why?" He shrugged. It was a genuine shrug, not a dismissive one, the shrug of someone looking at a very simple thing and finding when they try to explain it, that simple things are the hardest to explain precisely. "Because they were here," he said, "and they needed it. And I was the only one who could do it." Deepwater Memory looked at him, then at Chevette, then at the Cathalamar's battered, over-modified, lived-in docking bay with its shelves of mismatched tools and its walls covered in the technical notes and navigational markings of decades of use, and its smell of machine oil and something sweet, and the distant sound from somewhere in the engineering section of a human humming a melody. She said something that the translation device rendered, after a moment, as "I think we have much to discuss." "Probably," Day said. "Come on. Yarvo will make something to eat. It's good, if you can handle the mineral content." She hesitated at the base of the ramp. "Will it be difficult," she said, "for your crew to have a Drevet on the ship?" Ace glanced at Chevette, who gave him the specific compressed silence that meant "I'll follow your lead on this one." He thought about 11 dimensions that had been incompatible for 300 years. He thought about one sky that had found a color that didn't exist in any of them individually. "It was difficult for me too at first," he said. "Give it about a week, you'll see." He led her up the ramp and into the ship, and the ship's lighting shifted to its warm midday setting. And somewhere forward, Osi was running survey analysis, and somewhere aft Jarvo was making the mineral tea that tasted terrible to Dace, and that he'd never once asked to stop being offered, because the offering was the point. And in the observation bay, the sky of the integrated Earth was a color that still didn't have a name, and it filled the port completely, from edge to edge, with all the colors that had once been separate. The Drevat fleet got its drives repaired over the following 3 weeks. Dace watched from the Kethalomer's observation deck as, one by one, the capital ships lit their drives and oriented away, not in tactical formation, in no particular formation at all, actually individually, on what the passive navigation sensors suggested were individually chosen routes to individually chosen destinations. As if, with the anchor projector gone and the war aim it had been built to achieve gone with it, the fleet had nothing to be a fleet for and was quietly, collectively deciding to be ships instead. The last one to light its drive was the primary capital, It sat in the middle distance for nearly an hour after the others had gone, dark and quiet, doing something with its own internal accounting that Dace found he had no trouble respecting. Some things took time, then it lit its drive. The flare was blue-white and clean in the new sky. Deepwater Memory watched it go from beside him at the observation port. She'd been on the ship for 3 days now. She ate with the crew, slowly, carefully, the mineral content clearly hitting her digestive system harder than Dace's, but she didn't complain. She asked O.C. careful, well-framed questions about the integration theory. She made the specific descending sound that meant, "This is inadvisable, but I understand why you..." Redoing it when Jarvo, without ceremony, brought her a cup of the mineral tea. And Dace laughed, because of course Jarvo did. "Your fleet is leaving," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that what you wanted?" She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted a single coherent reality with no dimensional instability," she said. "That is what we have. The method was..." She paused. "Not what I expected. You expected a collapse. We expected what we had always expected, that the only way to stop the convergence events was to reduce the complexity. Collapse to simplicity." She looked at the sky, that new color, unnameable. "It did not occur to us that the direction of reduction might be wrong." "You were thinking about it from the wrong direction," Dace said. "You were trying to go back to simple. But the simple state is gone, 300 years gone. You can't get back to it. Forward was the only option." Deepwater Memory was quiet. "Forward to a complexity that exceeds any of the individual components," she said. "That's how it tends to work," Dace said. She looked at him. "Is that a human saying?" "Might as well be," he said. "We tend to like things that get more complicated as they get better." She made a sound that the translation device, after a moment, tagged as unverified humorous response, a category it had apparently created specifically for Drevat reactions to things Dace said. He decided that was progress. The name for the sky color came from Ose. She was 17 months post-integration, writing the comprehensive theoretical paper that was going to define dimensional physics for the next century, when she stopped in the middle of a calibration session and looked at the observation port and said, apparently to herself, "Denver Kai." Dace looked up. "What?" "The color." She nodded at the sky. "I have been trying to find a word for it. It has been bothering me for months. What does Denver Kai mean?" She thought about how to translate it. Roughly, the light that comes from all directions at once. She paused. In Yal, Kai is the specific quality of light that has no single source. Denver is a verb that means to arrive from many places simultaneously and become coherent. Dace looked at the sky, at Denver Kai, at the light that comes from all directions at once. "That's exactly right," he said. O.C. wrote it down. Then she finished her calibration, and Dace went back to the engine conduit he'd been running, and the Keth Alamar moved through the sky of the integrated Earth, and the sky was Denver Kai, all the way to the horizon, in every direction, because that was simply what the sky was now. What it had always been going to be, given enough time and the right push at the right moment by the right person. Dace hummed while he worked, and the melody folded back into its beginning, and the ship moved forward, and everything that had been broken held together.